There's a pattern across the AI and education stories that I've been tracking, and I want to put a name to it in today's episode. AI keeps establishing itself in one specific instructional role across very different education systems. The role is coaching and feedback for teachers and students, and it shows up in district pilots in the US, in academic research, and now in a new philanthropic initiative for primary education in sub-Saharan Africa. The pattern is consistent enough that it deserves an examination on its own terms, not just as another AI story. Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So the piece that prompted today's episode is from Renaissance Philanthropy, written by Kumar Garg, announcing a new Gates Foundation program called STEP AI, Strengthening Teacher Effectiveness and Practice with AI. A note about the source here before we get into the episode. This is a funder making a public case for a program that hasn't run yet. So sub-Saharan Africa work is prospective. One piece of evidence cited in the piece is a US study from CU Boulder's HAP system in small group tutoring contexts. That sourcing matters because everything I'm about to say depends on reading the piece accurately. So the headline is that nearly 90% of 10-year-olds in Sub-Saharan Africa cannot read and understand a simple text, and fewer than 1 in 10 teachers demonstrate full mastery of the primary curriculum. Most teachers receive limited ongoing coaching or feedback because supervisor to teacher ratios are extreme, infrastructure is uneven, and pedagogical expertise is unevenly distributed. The coaching that does happen is described as infrequent, delayed, or generic. Now, Renaissance and Gates are funding STEP AI to explore whether AI-enabled tools can fill that gap by analyzing classroom interactions and giving teachers timely, personalized feedback. They point to the CU Boulder research showing measurable improvements in tutoring practice when coaches acted on AI-generated feedback. They're careful to say this isn't about automated teaching, it's about augmenting instructional support where coaching capacity is constrained. That's the case that Renaissance is making, and I take that case seriously. There are real learners right now in classrooms where no coaching is coming, no feedback is arriving, and no induction support exists for first-year teachers. So saying, wait until we can find human coaches at scale is not actually a viable position because that scale isn't coming. The honest version of the Renaissance argument, I think, has moral weight for that reason, and I want to acknowledge that before we get into the analytical part. Now, my editorial observation, and this is a reason we're spending 10 minutes on this, is that Renaissance is the latest instance of a pattern. In episode 1, we talked about Google's AI-suggested feedback in Google Classroom, where the gap was the writing comment that doesn't arrive in time. In episode 10, we talked about a Washington Post piece on a high school teacher using GPT for student writing feedback, where the gap was the second draft the student never gets a comment on. Now Renaissance is talking about teacher coaching in sub-Saharan Africa, where the gap is the coaching visit that doesn't happen. Different systems, different stakes, but I think it's a similar role for AI. Feedback and coaching keeps being the place where AI is taking root. Now, I taught in public high school, an independent high school, a summer program for students who'd be the first in their families to go to college, a United States Navy, and in a university teacher education program. Now, across all 5 settings, I received almost no observation of my teaching, and the observations I did receive were really evaluative and summative. They weren't intended to give me feedback that I could actually use to get better. I've also coached at the high school, college, and club levels, and the picture there was the same. Almost no observation, almost no feedback. Now, if you told me back then that I could have had feedback on my teaching from a robot versus nothing at all, I would have chosen the robot. That's not because I'm endorsing AI coaching per se. That's really me saying that the profession is tolerating an absence of feedback for so long that the bar to clear is genuinely low. Renaissance is responding to the most acute version of a vacuum that has existed for a long time in different forms across the teaching profession everywhere. That brings me to why I think we're seeing this pattern repeat. I don't think it's a coincidence, and there's a framework that explains it. In 2003, the business strategist Clayton Christensen, working with his colleague Michael Rayner, published a book called The Innovator's Solution. In it, he named a pattern he called competing against non-consumption. His observation was that the biggest growth opportunities for new products are often in markets where the alternative isn't a competing product, it's nothing at all. The example he liked to use was the Sony Pocket Radio in the 1950s. The Pocket Radio didn't compete with home audio systems, it competed with teenagers having no radio. The bar Sony had to clear was to be better than nothing. And because the bar was low, the technology had room to develop, get cheaper, and eventually compete with the home audio market that it originally avoided. The last part is what makes Christensen's frame useful here, I think. Products that enter through non-consumption don't stay there. They improve, they get cheaper, and expand. And eventually they compete with the incumbent on the incumbent's home turf. That's the historical pattern that Christensen documented across many industries. So if we apply that to what Renaissance is describing, we'll see that Renaissance and Gates' proposal is basically, in Christensen's terms, a textbook non-consumption play. The customer is teacher development systems that can't afford human coaching at scale. The bar to clear is better than nothing. The market logic is basically the same as what Christensen identified 20 years ago. It doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it predictable. What's worth keeping our eyes open about is the second half of Christensen's pattern. The AI coaching layer that starts as a supplement for under-resourced systems tends, over time, to look like an alternative to better resourced ones. That's what happened in industry after industry. And if the pattern holds here, the district that has human instructional coaches today may, in 5 or 10 years, be looking at a procurement decision that asks why it's funding humans when an AI coaching alternative is available at a fraction of the cost. So I want to differentiate this for 3 different audiences that I'm always thinking of with these podcasts. For teachers, I think the practical observation is about the comparison group. When an AI feedback or coaching tool arrives in your building, the implicit comparison is often this versus the feedback you wouldn't have gotten anyway. I think that's a real comparison in a lot of cases. It's also the comparison most likely to make the tool look indispensable, regardless of how good it actually is. I think that's worth noticing when that's the comparison that's being used. For instructional coaches, Christensen's pattern points to a question that's analytically useful as a diagnostic. Which parts of your coaching work are constitutive of the practice, where your presence is the point, and which parts are you doing because you happen to be the available labor doing a task that could, in principle, be done another way? Different coaches will answer differently for different parts of the work, and I think that's the point. The diagnostic isn't telling us what to do, it's telling us where to focus our thinking about our role. For district leaders, I think this is a procurement question. When a vendor pitches an AI coaching or feedback tool, whether it's for in-class teaching, tutoring, or student writing, for example, ask what comparison group they're benchmarking against. If the answer is districts that have no coaches at all, and in many vendor pitches, I think it implicitly is, that's a real argument for some contexts and not others. The procurement question worth pressing on is whether you're being offered a tool that's better than nothing or a tool that's better than the human investment you might otherwise make. And the nothing could be because you can't afford to make that investment, I should add. These are different decisions, and I think the framing of the pitch can sometimes blur what you're actually asked to consider as in the procurement process. So I think the risk here isn't that AI fills genuine gaps in coaching and feedback. The gaps are real, and there's a real case to fill them. The risk is more structural. It's that the existence of the adequate AI layer is going to make the absence of human investment feel like a solved problem rather than an unsolved one. And I think that Christensen's pattern suggests that the drift is the default direction, not the exception. So the point for educators who are listening to this isn't whether to be for or against AI coaching, but instead how well you can see the market dynamic emerging. So the diagnostic that I'd offer is to look at your own work, whatever role it is that you're in. Ask yourself which parts of it you feel were materially diminished if it were done well, that is, not poorly, by an AI. The parts you can answer that question for are the parts where the human is genuinely constitutive of the activity. I've used that word twice. What do I mean by constitutive? When I say something's constitutive of an activity, I mean that it isn't just one ingredient among many. It's part of what makes the activity be the activity at all. Remove it and you don't have a diminished version of the same thing. You have a different thing. So for example, a jury trial without a jury is not a faster trial. It's an administrative hearing. The human presence of the jury isn't just doing efficiency work in the jury trial. It's what makes the proceeding a jury trial in the first place. The legitimacy and the meaning of the activity come from the configuration of humans in the room. You could probably get more consistent outcomes from an algorithm, but you'd also have stopped doing the thing that the jury system is designed for. From a teaching perspective, knowing a particular student well enough to recognize when their work product doesn't match what you know about their thinking, that's not data analysis being done slowly by a human. It's the teacher's accumulated knowledge of the student, work, and student as a human that is the thing itself. So the parts that you have trouble identifying that would be materially diminished if they were done well by AI are the parts where I think Christensen's pattern is probably already in motion. The question becomes what you want to do with the time, attention, or budget that's opening up, and whether you have a clear answer before somebody else makes that decision for you. So here are a couple of questions to leave you with, and I'd love your comments. When a vendor or a pilot pitches an AI tool to you, what comparison group are they using implicitly or explicitly? And is it the one that you agree with? Would you have chosen that? A future episode will look more specifically at the US tools in this category, the platforms that are already marketing AI coaching, observation, and feedback to teachers in American districts, and what their evidence base actually shows. In the meantime, I'd love your comments, please, and thank you, as always, for spending a little time. We'll see you next episode.